The 11th talk in our series features Mr. Mathew Sewell talking on resilience leadership, leading in a crisis, the Nightingale Experience, and Dr. Nicola Burgess from Warwick Business School speaking on involving people in quality improvement, and she brings her experience from the NHS-Virginia Mason Institute partnership.
So, good evening, everyone, again. Thank you for joining us again. And this is the 11th today in our series of resilience talks. And we have two speakers this time, again, one of which is our own co-organizer. So I'm joined by Ali Mehdi, who has thought up of this project, and we have persisted so far, and this is finally the 11th one. So amongst the two speakers, we have Matt Sewell, who's a pediatric and adult spinal surgeon in London at the Barts Hospital, and he has been heavily involved with the Nightingale Hospital when it was first set up. And he's going to speak to us about resilience leadership and leadership in crisis. The second talk is from Dr. Nicola Burgess, who's Associate Professor of Operations Management at Warwick Business School. And she's going to bring in her experience and talk from the NHS-Virginia Mason Institute partnership and how involving people in quality improvement processes within our organizations can be helpful and beneficial. Just some usual housekeeping rules as before. So there is a chat box, which we will have it open in the side. And as previously, we have seen quite a lot of interaction there, and hopefully people comments there. People can raise questions. We will monitor those, and we will bring in speakers when we are able to at the end of the two talks. These will be, hopefully, we can get you to speak about your own questions and talk about those. But if that isn't possible, then we'll certainly raise it for you. Can I pass it on to you, Matt, then, Mr. Matt Sewell, for the first talk, please. Thanks, Matt.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 11th Resilience Talk. So hopefully the sort of 10-15 minutes that I'll spend with you today, it'll help sort of refresh some of the concepts from the series so far. So I'm going to start by sharing my slides with you and hope that you can all hear me clearly, and then we'll go from there. So let's put them on and slideshow.
Yeah, Matt can see them. Fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Good. Well, let's start. So the theme of this talk is leading in crisis. And we're going to use some experience of mine from the Nightingale and also wider contextual experience from the world. So leading in crisis, who do you think of when you think of a crisis leader? I thought of this myself, and I thought, given what's happening in America at the moment, Nelson Mandela was a good figure to start with. You know, this man was in prison for 27 years. And some of you will remember this picture in 1990 when he first took his first breaths of fresh air. Now, he was a leader with many fantastic attributes, but he put people first because he knew when he came out, he had to set a vision for his country. And his country's vision was rebuilding and reconciliation. So how did he do it? He did it by explaining, by including, and by executing. And they're the central themes of this talk today. And there's many anecdotes about things he did, but one of the first things Nelson Mandela did when he left jail was he sat down with his jailers, the people that had kept him in a soulless cell for 27 years. And he asked them, what can we do together to rebuild our country? And he wanted to answer three questions. What can I do when I leave to say, are people better off? Do our children have a brighter future? And are we coming together as a community and a society rather than being torn apart? Because if you can answer yes to those three questions, it doesn't matter what sort of leader you are, whether you're shy, whether you're very animated, whether you're small or tall, able, disabled. If you can achieve these and say yes to each of these questions, you've been an effective leader. And I believe, and Nelson Mandela believes, and hopefully we believe, that a more effective way to answer yes to these questions is to envision where we are now and where we're going, to explain how we will get there, to include people in the process, and to execute on what we do and say. Because if we do those, we engender trust. So we're going to talk about how that may be. And I want you to keep an open mind today, please. So as you listen to this talk, we're going to keep it clean. And I want you to understand there's always more than one perspective for various things, as Prince William gladly has shown here. So, you know, thinking back to where we've come from, 6 months ago, we were living very different lives. You know, I was still working as a surgeon and I was doing Himalayan trips and expeditions. And as I was going into the hospital, I would see the high streets full of shoppers, the classrooms full of children, and the offices full of office workers. And then we think somewhere in China, a bat bit a cat or a cat bit a bat, we don't know. And then all sorts of crazy things happened. The streets became bare. This is Wuhan in China. And as global travel enabled this dark mist of death to spread, we saw the coffins, people will remember, the coffins in Italy. And then we recognized that there was a significant problem that we were about to face. And in the UK, many of us think now, it's easy on hindsight that we started slow because infection rates are rising. We didn't have enough testing equipment at the beginning, and this personal protective equipment we've heard so much about wasn't freely available. And some of you will remember that there was a paper, a research paper that the scientific advisors produced that suggested unmitigated, that means if we didn't do anything, there could be 500,000 deaths in the UK. Now that's an extraordinary amount. If you think about how many people might die in war every day, 500,000 deaths. Now, if you think about how many ICU beds, that's the intensive care beds there are in the UK normally, there's maybe 5,000. So if you had 500,000 people wanting 5,000 ventilated beds or up to, that's a pretty difficult challenge to meet. And this was the reason and philosophy or the birth of the Nightingale Hospital. So we wanted to create 4,000 beds. Now that's an awful lot. If you think of your local hospital, just to put things in perspective, they may have 500, 600, 800 beds. So this hospital, or the Excel Centre, which was a rock concert, was planned to be about 5 to 6 times the size of your local hospital. And if you think in your local hospital, you may only have maybe 10, 20, 30 intensive care beds, we were going to put 4,000 in the Nightingale. So that's an extraordinary feat to achieve. And to do that, we needed 16,000 staff. Oh, it was needed within weeks because we didn't have time to wait because the virus waits for no one. And we achieved the development and the building through collaboration between the military, free commercial enterprise and the NHS working together in a matter of weeks. And this is a picture of one of the corridors of beds, just ventilated beds, of which there were many, many, many 10s, 20, 30 of these corridors that we potentially had to fill. And we didn't know at that stage whether they would be filled. But we built the place, but you can see it's empty. And this was the problem we faced. It was the staffing. Remember I said it was people at the start that make organizations. Organizations don't make people. And people were concerned because you can see me here in my inadequate PPE for those healthcare workers, although I've got a smile on my face. They were concerned that they might catch some and give it to their loved ones, their children, or themselves. So recruitment was an issue. So how do you overcome a challenge? Well, we envisioned what we wanted to do. Now, just for reference, this isn't a patient, this is a dummy. It's a very expensive dummy. It's actually £85,000, believe it or not, because it goes beep when you do something wrong. And we said that we needed to staff it safely with 16,000 staff. That was the size of the challenge. And we explained why we needed to do it and how we were going to do it. So we're giving people here on the left an induction as to why it was necessary and why they were so important. And on the right, you can see me here teaching about giving oxygenation and how we might do that safely to people. And of course, we had to include people, because remember, inclusion is very important when you're leading in crisis. And it's always important to remember that teams make better decisions than individuals. There was a guy called Jim Therowecki. He's a US journalist, and he did an awful lot of research, social science research, on teams and decision making. And he said, out of the people listening today, if we pick the top 2 or 3 cleverest people, the highest IQ people, put them in a room, and then put all the rest of us in a different room, and we get given 10 questions, you can guarantee the people will come up with the best decisions would be the rest of us, not the top 3 with the highest IQ. Because the diversity of decisions and understanding always make for better decision making. And that's about inclusion. So as a leader, you have to work out in your organizations, how do you include people so you can get the best ideas out there to make the best decisions going forward. And what we found out was, as I said to you, a lot of people were telling us that they were really worried. So we massively expanded the well-being teaching such that it was one of the largest departments, because we had to make people believe that they were going to be safe, not because we were trying to dupe them or put them in an unsafe environment, just to know that we were taking all the precautions necessary, and in an imperfect situation, we were going to try and create the most perfect environment for them to learn. And we did it by creating a psychologically safe environment where people could express their feelings, and we flattened hierarchies. Such although there were senior decision makers, everyone felt empowered to speak up and say how they were feeling and thinking. And this included the nation. And some of you may have been involved with clapping, because on the Thursday nights, which was beautiful to hear and see, because it meant that everyone was working together towards this combined vision. And then, of course, we executed. So we managed to train enough staff to open at the time when the NHS hospitals were overspilling, to ensure that everyone who needed help or oxygen support had it. And although we weren't needed to the extent that we had initially planned for, just like house insurance, it was there if we needed it. Unfortunately, we didn't need it. But we are on standby, as many of you know, so that if there is this predicted second wave, and we're all hoping it's going to be more of a trickle than a tsunami, the Nightingale will be there to look after the people of this country if necessary. And so some of the key lessons were that creative cooperation works better than conflict. And in times of crisis, it's much easier to have conflict as a reason to induce behavior than cooperation, but cooperation trumps conflict all the time. And there's a good story that I always remember from a Nobel Prize winning microbiologist, a guy called Leo Wilson. Now, he's probably about 80 or 90 now. And he said, he wrote a book called The Social Conquest of Earth. And he said that the most successful species on this planet in terms of preventing being exterminated, which is pertinent at the moment, are bees, ants, termites, and people. Now, that's an unusual group for us to get lumped with. But his argument was that these animals and species, they work together, particularly. And take an ant, many species of ant, for example, when they're escaping from predators, one of them will climb to the top of a leaf so that the predator will be distracted and maybe eat this little ant so that the majority can escape. And there are many examples in nature where team behavior always trumps individualism. But people are different. And he said, Leo said, that people are the greatest because we have consciousness and a conscience, which makes us the greatest species at being able to survive. But it also makes us have vulnerabilities. particularly arrogance, not being able to listen, and making us prone to error and not acknowledging error when it's there. But he said, despite what's happening in the world today, whether it's rainforests burning, ice caps melting, computers taking everyone's job, he had a lot to be optimistic about, because he said when the chips are down, usually humans do the right thing when they work together. And there's one more thing I want to make about sort of leadership in crisis, and it's got a healthcare theme, obviously, is you've got to look around the corner as a leader, even in crisis times. Now, the best example I can give for this is, from a healthcare perspective, is back in sort of early 2000s, the US and UK were very important in pouring money into the World Genome Project. Now, at the time, there was not going to be any tangible benefits for the governments involved, and it was done as an international organization. But the investments that were made at the time, which were relatively small, a few £1 million here and there, have gone on to produce billions of pounds in productivity and economic benefit as a consequence of thinking about opportunities in the future. So it means, for example, a young woman who's got a family history of breast cancer, you can now go to the doctor and ask for a gene test. Or if your child has some sort of nasty cancer, he or she can now get a gene test to see if a certain type of chemotherapy drug will be beneficial. So as leaders, we also have to think about the crisis times, but the opportunities, and think ahead and not just be stuck in the moment. So defining leadership in crisis, back to what Nelson Mandela thought of at the beginning. When you lead a team, you have to ask yourself, are people better off when I leave than when I started? Do our children and our people have a brighter future? And are we coming together rather than being torn apart? Because however you lead, whatever you do, if you can answer yes to each of these questions, you're a successful leader, whether you talk with a squeaky voice or not. And I believe it's easier to answer yes to those questions. Nelson Mandela believes it's easier to answer yes to those questions. And hopefully together we can see that the benefits of answering yes to those questions can be more readily achieved when we understand it's people that make organizations. And if we envision, we explain, we include, and we execute, we're more likely to achieve the goal that we're after. And this is even more important in times of crisis. Thank you very much. So I'm going to pass it back to Ali, who's now going to hopefully summarize some of the key themes of that talk.
If there's one key word people have to remember, it's inclusion. So organizations have to be inclusive, teams have to be inclusive, and leadership at every level needs to be inclusive, because ultimately it's people that make organizations successful. Our next speaker is going to be Nicola Burgess, who's going to continue on the theme of people. Nicola is an associate professor of organizational management with a special interest in healthcare. So I thought it was pertinent to bring Nicola into this session to talk about the role people have in developing successful quality improvement, but also to look at a customer care focus for the people that we in healthcare serve, our patients. So Nicola, it's over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me. And wonderful talk from Matthew. Very much enjoyed it. It very much chimes with some of the things that I'm going to talk about as well. So I'm just going to share my screen, hopefully. Let's have a go. Not done this before, so that doesn't look good. Hold on. Okay, can you all see my PowerPoint? Just nod.
Not yet, Nicola.
You can't see it?
Yes, you can see it now. Perfect.
That's excellent. Okay, so yes, I'm going to talk to you about QI and the customer. So just a little bit about me before I start. I'm a reader of operations management, which unfortunately doesn't mean that I get to read a lot. It's just a title on the sort of slippery pole to professor. That's where we are. I've been interested in healthcare improvement for quite some time now, And probably over 10 years, I've been looking at quality improvement in healthcare, patient safety, knowledge mobilisation, leadership, all those things. It's a really interesting context to study. I've worked on various healthcare projects funded by NIHR, ESRC, if that means anything to you, and the Health Foundation. Currently, I'm leading a national evaluation of the NHS-VMI partnership, which is the Virginia Mason Institute. So I don't know whether any of you know about the Virginia Mason partnership. It was started by everybody's favourite politician, particularly junior doctors. That's Jeremy Hunt back in 2015. And I've been involved evaluating that partnership since 2018. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our early findings from that. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the partnership itself, because it would take up too much time, but I would like to be able to share some early findings. And as I say, they really chime with what Matthew's been talking to us about already. So the aims of the session today is really having a think about the customer and the customer perspective, and also to highlight the importance of social factors in developing an improvement culture. So the first point to make really is that all improvement needs to start with understanding value from the perspective of the customer. So all improvement theories over the last 100 years really have thought about improvement in terms of the customer, because if we don't know what the customer values, how do we know that we are improving? So in healthcare, we might need to sort of just give a bit of thought to who's the customer, because we don't generally like to think of ourselves as healthcare professionals as having customers. It's an uncomfortable term, isn't it? So probably many of you would say that the patient is the customer. They're the people that we ultimately serve. Maybe you'll think about the patient's family as well. Maybe the public, maybe even the commissioner, because they ultimately are paying for services. And then when we think about value and how we maximise value for our patients, that's about achieving the best patient outcomes, isn't it, for the lowest possible cost, because if we can keep our costs low, then we can treat more customers, but always with that emphasis on best possible patient outcomes. But these are our external customers, okay? So they're the people that pay for and use the service. What I want to do today is to get you to think also about the internal customer. And the internal customer are those who you have a relationship with through employment and as partners. Essentially, I'm talking about ourselves, I'm talking about colleagues, I'm talking about treating our team members as customers and applying the same types of principles to our team members when we are doing handovers, when we are passing a patient from one department or one ward to another. The people that we pass those patients on to become the customers of our services. And so we really need to think about, how can we improve service, not just to the external customer, but also the internal customer. And what does that mean in terms of maximising value? So value from an internal customer's perspective, what's that? And I think it's about promoting stability, and particularly within sort of the present crisis, having stability, having psychological safety so that we feel safe to be able to speak up about our feelings, about our fears, about something that might not be quite right, all those kind of things. It's about teamwork, helping each other and helping one another to maximise our potential as professionals. Ultimately, when we think about value from the perspective of the internal customer, I think we should be thinking about respect for humanity. And I think something that the coronavirus has done for humanity inside and outside of the hospital is it's really, I think, brought to the fore the importance of showing our respect and working together, and the clapping on the streets is all part of that. So I'm going to talk very briefly about Lean as a quality improvement approach that has two pillars. Okay, so I've been looking at lean for, as I said, many, many years. And for most of us, lean is very much about continuous improvement. It's about the application of principles, tools, methods to eliminate waste so that we can provide a more efficient, a more effective service to the patient. But the reason I like this house, and if you were to Google sort of a lean house, you'll see many variations of this, but I like this one. I've adapted it slightly. Because the reason I like this one is because we've got two pillars. One is the technical and one is the social. Okay, so when we encounter lean, when we encounter quality improvement, we're often just encountering the technical side. So we might do a bit of process mapping to understand the process, involve our teammates and understand where the waste is and think about how we can redesign processes, things like that. That's all great, brilliant. It's a technical side. And what we need to be thinking more about is this respect for people side. One of the things that I've learned over the last 2 years as part of the evaluation of the NHS-VMI partnership is that this social side of change is so important. And I'd like to be able to show you over the next few slides that no matter how good you are at the technical side of change, unless you've got this respect for people, you will not achieve improvements in value in terms of the best possible outcomes and the lowest cost. And that this twin pillar can be executed only through a receptive culture, which is built over time, and this idea of shared leadership that is facilitated, so that we have, as leaders, we demonstrate coaching behaviours, so that instead of going in and trying to fix problems for others, we encourage them to address them themselves, we empower them, we give them permission to make changes. So when we're talking about respect for people then, it's about listening to others, okay, but active listening. It's about enabling others to make improvements, to show them and give them permission to use improvement tools and to change the work that they do, because the people at the front line, of course, know the work the best. They are best placed to make changes to their work. Respect for people is about working in teams and sharing ideas, collaborating. It's also about civility, just being nice. And I'm sure many of us have encountered maybe managers or colleagues who've just been really short with you, or just a little bit demanding and disrespectful. And if you feel that impact on your performance, for me, and it's happened to me many occasions, as I'm sure it does many of us, it really severely impacts how I feel about myself, my ability to do work, and my desire. It disincentivizes me to get on and do stuff. So it's really, really important we pay attention to these things. About 18 months ago, I was fortunate to listen to a talk by a medical consultant based at University Hospitals Coventry, and he was talking about civility. And in fact, he'd launched a campaign called Civility Saves Lives. And it was a really, really powerful talk, because I think I didn't realise that everybody suffered from this. You know, when someone is a bit rude, that we all feel, you know, negative, and that affects our performance. And there's a whole lot of science behind this that says actually, you know, when someone is rude to a colleague, it reduces our cognitive ability by 61%. That's really significant. And that means that we're more likely to make an error, and we're less likely to help others. And there's more research around this also that shows that doesn't just impact upon the person, but it impacts anybody who's in the vicinity that actually observes that kind of behaviour. So it's really, really important that we pay attention to this respect for people pillar of improvement. So when we talk about QI approaches like lean, we need to remind ourselves that they are socio-technical. So in medical terms, that's like the study of physiology and anatomy. Okay, you cannot understand one without the other. You don't get technical change. Okay, you don't get quality improvement across a system without understanding people and relationships. And likewise, we need to understand people and relationships to be able to drive change. Okay, so when we're talking about developing a culture of continuous improvement capability, which is what the NHS-VMI partnership that I'm evaluating is striving to do, we must pay attention to both the social and technical aspects of change. Some really bad animation there. So what I wanted to do just for this short presentation was to highlight these social factors that have really come out strong themes through my evaluation. And that's the role of leadership and how leadership impacts culture, and the role of relationships and how connectedness across organisations really impacts performance. So just first to look at leadership. So what we've found is that when you have a systematic quality improvement, as Lean is designed to do, it's designed to be systematic, then that actually facilitates facilitative leadership or shared leadership using coaching behaviours. So I've given some examples from our research, and I appreciate there's a lot of text on the screen to read. But what we're trying to say is that actually, you know, often within our healthcare organisations, leaders get to be the level that they're at because they're good at fixing problems. So they go in, they wear their cape, you know, and they come in and they fix things. And sometimes they'll bang the table and say, you know, why has this happened? Sort it out, etc. And what our leaders have discovered through participating in the NHS-VMI partnership is that actually we need to frame problems, we need to coach people to solve problems at the front line, we need to be more inclusive. Yeah, there's no good being up in our ivory tower and taking decisions without involving people at the operational front line. The more levels of management we can include in our decision making, the better the decisions will be. And I really like this quote over on the right hand side of the screen. This was from one of our CEOs who talks about how, you know, in the old days, he used to be pretty autocratic, I'd say yes, no, yes, no, yes, no to things. Whereas now, you know, not really in charge anymore. The clinicians are in charge. And what you can take from that is the level of trust within that organisation, the level of ability among the leadership team. We've got a shared leadership in place. Now, I've got another organisation that I work with, and they're not in such a good place. And they would say the same, that they're not in charge, that the clinicians are in charge. But in that scenario, it's a really bad thing because they're not working together. They don't have a shared goal. In this case, we have a shared goal. We're all working towards the same outcomes. We hold the same values, etc. And it's a really positive place to be in. So that's leadership. And as I said, the other key finding really is around relationships, and relationships really matter. What we did to evaluate or to understand relationships a bit more was we wanted to look at how individuals, healthcare professionals who had received a substantial amount of training in Lean or quality improvement, so it was 9 months of training. Obviously, most of our healthcare organisations are many thousands of people, and so you can't train everybody at the same time. And we were interested to understand to what extent these trained professionals were returning to their place of work and implementing their knowledge and talking to others about their knowledge of improvement. so as to get more people on board. So we're interested in knowledge mobilisation to see how the knowledge was being spread organically through the organisation. But what we discovered, much to our surprise, because there was 5 organisations we were looking at, and we found that there was a very clear link between the level of connectedness among employees and the degree of process innovation and organisational performance. So even when 2 organisations had achieved the same level of technical competence of quality improvement, we found that performance only improved when the social connectedness was also high. I'm going to show you that sort of visually. So here's our example. We had Trust A and Trust D. So out of the 5 trusts that I was looking at, these 2 trusts had made the most progress with the technical aspects of lean implementation. They're being part of a partnership. They'd all received and were receiving the same resource investment, and they'd received the same coaching in quality improvement. They demonstrated the same level of leadership commitment. They had the same number of employees trained. They were the same size organisations. They were the same on almost every level. Trust A was rated outstanding by the CQC in February 2019, while Trust D entered special measures for quality. Okay. So very, very different outcomes. Same intervention, same progress, different outcomes. So when we look at our social network maps, this is what they look like. So this is Trust A. And what this shows, if you look at the circular nodes, they denote employees who've been trained in quality improvement. And these squares are the people they interact with about quality improvement. So we sent them a survey, a short template, just asking them, who do you talk to about improvement? Who comes to talk to you about improvement, and how frequently? So that we can map these relationships and understand how knowledge and practice about quality improvement was spreading throughout the organisation. So this is Trust A, this is our outstanding trust. What you can see here is a distributed network and a really high degree of connectivity. Everybody seems to be talking to each other. It's really wonderful to see. So dense clusters, groupings, high degree of collaboration. And what this tells us is that this organisation has a really high capacity to facilitate knowledge exchange and learning. So we compare that, or rather before we do that, this is an excerpt from the Care Quality Commission report, which mentions the VMI partnership many, many times and how they've implemented it with reference to culture, morale and performance. And you might note also that this organisation has a staff survey that placed the organisation in the top 20% for the past 3 years. And this trust in particular, back in 2010, was actually the worst performing trust in the country on every single performance metric. So quite a transformation. This is our special measures trust, and you can see straight away we've got a very different pattern of connectivity. So remember, we have the same amount of employees that have been trained in quality improvement. And what you can see is lots of isolated individuals. There's a lack of connectedness across this network. So 2/3 of the network is decentralized. You can see we have a chain-like pattern, which you can see across the bottom, which is sort of suggests a hierarchical sort of network. Okay, 1/3 of the network is completely disconnected with 14 isolates. And so we say that this is a low to moderate connectivity and low to moderate degree of interaction. So there's not so much talk here. This is another one of our trusts that is also in special measures. Now this trust has made very little progress with the technical and the social side. And you can see here that there is very little interaction and talk going on among trained individuals. So nobody's really talking about improvement. there's not a lot of collaboration going on. This trust in particular, at the start of the partnership, had a very, very poor culture. Okay, and that shows through in the way that the technical and social scientists really failed to gain traction within that organisation. So the point I'm trying to make here, really, in addition to all of Mathew's excellent points, is that actually nothing quite drives improvement like making time to talk. And so that when we come to work every day, those social relationships, regardless of hierarchy, are exceptionally important. When it comes to improvement, they make the difference between really driving change and transformation in an organisation, becoming an outstanding trust, okay, with very high staff morale and good patient outcomes. It's those relationships that make the difference. And that's the end of my slideshow, so I'll pass you back.
Thank you very much, Nicola. That's really interesting talk and really insightful, very thought-provoking and very topical as well. I think what I could get out of this was your analogy about the anatomy and physiology. I mean, we are all in these big structures, big hospital spaces, and that's the anatomy. But within that, if there is no communication between people and the social structure is absent, the body just doesn't function. And I think the respect bit that you mentioned is also very valuable. So I think the shared purpose and respect is what we need to take back from here. And that is what, if we can change within our workplaces, is that's going to bring about a change. We have seen in all this crisis, the shared leadership, where a lot of people have done much more, even though they are at junior level, than many senior leaders or many senior consultants and doctors. Whereas the nurses and healthcare assistants who are actually on the ground, on the front line, have been much more effective in terms of providing care and bringing about a change. It would be interesting to find out later on, maybe in the talk, about how exactly this change can be brought about. It's easy enough to say that we talk about and we speak to people on first name basis, and we basically know everyone that works in the department, whether it's porters or pathologists and others. But how exactly does that culture change when maybe the senior leaders are actually a bit resistant to that, and there is a bit of hesitation on the junior side about breaking that barrier from their side? And that's where the problem lies, I suppose. I don't know if you want to answer that at this stage, that'll be helpful, but we will take questions from the chat box as well. Ali, you've probably been monitoring, and there might be some comments there that we can bring in.
Before that, we'll invite Omo to tell us about next week's program.
Oh yeah, okay.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you guys. That was been a bit, that was very inspiring, but I just wanted to just let you know what is actually happening next week. Our next week conversation or talk is called The Other Pandemic, is Allyship and Antidote to Exclusion. And that's going to be run by Dr. Fatima. She's done a lot of research around this, and she goes around and she talks to people in the NHS. She's worked in Kent University, and really just looking at organizations, ways to break exclusion within the organization. And also that would be held by myself. I'm a dentist by background, but I'm also a leadership and well-being coach. So we really just want to invite you to that talk. Once again, is The Other Pandemic, is Allyship and Antidote to Exclusion. So please do come along for that talk next week.
Fantastic. Before I begin with the chat boxes, I'd like to say that the talk today has been about inclusion. The talk has been about how organizations, leaders and managers and team members need to be inclusive to be able to get the best results, and the best results for customers. I mean, on that note, I have to say that there was a question in the chat box, or a comment in the chat box about customers. Do we actually, so there was a concern that the commercial connotations associated with the word customer in a compassionate human care atmosphere of healthcare. Nicola, could you please elaborate on what a customer means? Because a customer usually sounds very transactional to a lot of people in the non-commercial space.
Yeah, so usually a customer is the person that pays for the service. So in healthcare, that still doesn't help a great deal, does it? So I've always, when I teach, I always talk about the customer as being about the patient, because a healthcare professional, I'm not a healthcare professional, but really, on your behalf, I imagine the customer is always the patient, because they are the people that you are there to serve. I don't honestly think it matters. I think customers are often, they will come from different places. It's very rare to have just one customer. You usually have lots. Okay? And it's just about putting yourself in their shoes. The best way to do that, of course, is to ask them. And so with a lot of improvement work, when you are looking to improve the process, a department, or whatever it is that you want to improve, the best way to do that, of course, is to involve the patient in any way.
Sure. Could I just add to that, please? I mean, my understanding, again, about customers, it's a transaction. So there are lots of transactions. They're not necessarily commercial. A transaction of goodness, a transaction of a professional exchange, a transaction of learning. So I would have no hesitation, actually, in applying the customer service, if you like, proposition to how we deal with people at work, how we deal with patients. Because personally, from my own learnings over the last few years, I find that customer service is about, setting the correct expectation and meeting that perception, which I find extremely useful when it comes to patients. I think sometimes the medical profession overestimates about what it can deliver as against setting, if you like, a more realistic expectation.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think that's spot on. I completely agree. Customer service principles, of course, do apply. It's just to what extent we are comfortable with using those terms, and often we're not, I think, within the healthcare capacity. It's the same when we talk about money. Nobody likes to talk about money in healthcare unless you're a manager, of course, and it's about saving money. But the narrative, so for instance, the BMI partnership that I'm evaluating, as an evaluator, I'm coming under a lot of pressure to look at what financial savings have we made here. And our chief executives that are part of this partnership have all been quite resolute that this is not about saving money. They know that by improving processes and getting better outcomes for patients, we will save money, because good quality does cost less. But when we make the narrative about money and financial savings and cost improvement, it turns people off. So they're very, very clear about that. This is about improving quality. This is about putting the patient at the centre of everything we do.
There have been some common themes here in the chat boxes, and they relate to managers, I suppose, yes. What's your feeling about managers, Nicola? And Matt, I mean, how do you find managers can be effective? And what do you think the culture of a manager is? How do you define the culture of a manager, and how does one adapt to that culture? Because there are different cultures of nursing, which are more team-based, and cultures within doctors that are more patient-focused, and I suppose managers, you would argue, would be resource-focused. Is there something that you would recommend on how we could all feel comfortable with the culture of a manager? Because let's face it, they're here to stay.
Well, I think it's, sorry, I was going to say, I can only answer, do you want to go first, Nicola?
So from my perspective and from my research, the best thing that managers can do is to understand quality improvement, okay, and for that to go right across the organisation, so that we start talking the same language rather than seeing ourselves as something different. Yeah, so rather as the manager's just there to manage budget, no, we're all there, we're all part of the same team. So the way that it's worked best in my experience is when managers are training in quality improvement alongside healthcare professionals, and we approach this as one team.
I think that, you know, the problem is I'm biased because I'm a surgeon and I'm a clinician with my clinician hat on. And most people, a lot of our listeners are actually clinicians as well. And we know that clinicians and managers do fight, but we also know when the clinician and the manager get on well, with a good working relationship, they're more likely to achieve things together. And it may be something simple as getting a theatre list on a Thursday to do an operation you've been really wanting to do for the last week. And I guess for people that don't work in healthcare, it may be people in the operations department maybe not getting on or sort of having an argument about finance with people in the marketing department or the strategy department. And so I think the way forward is to try and, in some way, just like I was saying before, envision, explain, and include. So if you can try and understand what the other person's perspective is, check that you all work on the same path going to the same summit, and then you just have to try and argue your case as best you can whilst respecting the other person. Because at least if you've listened to the other person, they feel respected. And that's half the problem. So, you know, clinicians, sometimes we don't feel managers respect us because maybe we think we do great things and we don't get the reward in terms of the help that we want. And maybe managers are really trying to get patients through, and maybe they feel clinicians are a bit difficult because they only think about their own set of patients. And so it's just getting that communicative environment in which people can start talking between one another. It sounds simple, but it's very hard to achieve. But effective leaders can do it. And that's the secret. So, and it depends, as I say, it depends on individuals and what your personal qualities are and what your contextual environment is and the individuals you're dealing with. And I think if you can try and, as I say, envision, include and explain, I'm just keeping the word simple so we get the key messages over, then how you do it following those principles will depend on the environment that you're in. But we know that when there's a good relationship, there's a harmonious working pattern, you're more likely to get what you want together.
Points well made, Matt, because through the chat boxes, the themes again emerging are communication, about civility, particularly the theme that Nicola referred to in her talk. And I think it's about understanding one another, because at the end of the day, the managers are there as well to serve groups of patients using resources. And, you know, we as clinicians have been trained to treat the patient as individuals. And I think, you know, yes, there's a fundamental clash of philosophy. It's about treating the one against the masses. But, right, I mean, as long as there's common ground, I suppose there is some degree of harmony. Now, in your experience at the Nightingale, you know, it was a successful project in that it came up very quickly. What sort of good attributes, or what attributes did you see in a good manager that you were working with, or a good leader that you were working with?
Well, Ali makes a really good point about, you know, as an individual doctor, we're looking after our personal group of patients, particularly we're putting them at, you know, I guess the top of the pile with everything that we do. That's what we're here to do, look after our set of patients. Whereas managers maybe have to think about a greater, shall we say, population. But what you have to do is you have to make sure that you're on the same path as them, going to the same place. Because when managers are more interested in targets and finances than patients and good quality service, just like Nicola was saying with healthcare improvement, that's when there's a problem. But it's in these scenarios when good communication and crisis is even more important. Because what you want to avoid, what you must avoid, is a conflict situation. Because when you get conflict, people don't listen to the other side. And then you can never get your message across. And so I think it's very easy in times of conflict for groups, should we say, disadvantaged groups to be picked on. I mean, you just have to think of, you know, contextually, you know, World War II in Germany. You can pick many examples. But what you must do is include and explain. And if you do that very clearly and effectively, then I think you can make some progress, even when you're coming at it from different angles. But you have to ensure that you're on the same path, going to the same place. So I know that's a sort of metaphor, but that's the key thing. You have to understand where both parties are trying to get to, and then you can work together as best you can. And accept that you're not always going to get what you want. So, and with respect to the Nightingale, we all knew what we were trying to achieve, and we had the support of the military, commercial enterprise. Obviously, we had lots of money. So it was not really a problem. It's just about creating an environment in which people could effectively work together, and we did. And as I say, the problem was a lot of people didn't want to come to the Nightingale initially because they were really worried that it's going to be full of, the air you breathe was going to be full of virus. And so it caused a lot of anxiety. And when we listened and understood, then we could make a program that, in some way addressed those issues. So even though some people were still going to come to the teaching and not want to, or education, not want to work there for those reasons, understandably, at least they felt like we had addressed some of their concerns. And some of them would then be like, okay, well, they're taking our concerns.
You made a very good point. Yeah, sorry, excuse me, in the interest of time. You made a very good point there. Resources were not an issue, so that's why I think people got on better, especially because there was a shared purpose as well. Nicola, would you have anything to add to Matt's points?
No, but only that I agree with them. I think, as I said before, I think narrative is important. The way that we frame issues, we need to connect with the frames of managers, and managers need to connect with the frames of clinicians and find that shared purpose, because there is a shared purpose there. And sometimes it's just in the language. So completely concur with what Mathew said. It's about finding that common goal and working towards that together.
I'd like to invite people on screen as well to be able to just come on and ask any questions. We're going to run over a little bit today because we did start a bit late. Does anyone want to come on camera and ask any questions? You can unmute yourself. I suppose it's that time of the day where people...
While they do that, Nicola, and I think you have obviously worked with other institutes and other CEOs. I mean, the themes we have discussed today are not new, I suppose. These are all standard leadership course content. In spite of that, we are still discussing these and why these difficulties lie in these organizations. And the other theme running through the chat boxes is whether it's egos and whether it's the difficulty in not engaging with the employees. There's that disconnect between senior leadership and people on the ground. What is the resistance, and how does that need to be tackled so it can change? Smaller organizations is probably easier to achieve. Bigger organizations, particularly NHS trusts, you've shown those maps clearly. There's no social cohesion between such big organizations, smaller groups. How does that barrier, how can that barrier be broken, basically?
Okay, so in my experience, I'm looking at the partnership in particular, because of the 5 organisations, as I've already alluded to, they've not all had the same outcomes. And in fact, it's played out very differently, and that's due to context. And what we found is actually in the 2 organisations that have done particularly well, prior to the intervention, so pre-2015, they had actually done quite a lot of work collectively as an organisation on their shared values. So organisational strategy, what's our culture, what's our beliefs, what are we here? And this takes place sort of in a good 2 years prior to an intervention like this. Because organisations need to think about this. They need to think about what's our strategy, and they need to communicate it clearly and simply across the whole organisation, so that the whole organisation buys into it. That way, you're creating fertile ground for these kind of behaviours to grow. Okay, because often we come in, we're often products of our own experience, which can be a bit tainted. What we need to do is we need to tend the soil, as we say. So we need to turn it over. We need to say, right, let's go back to their roots. think about what we're here to do, agree collectively what our shared values are, who are we, what behaviours do we expect of each other as an organisation. So one of the organisations is Leeds, 18,000 staff, they've done this. So they've gone from being very poor performing to doing actually exceptionally well. And that started with this back to roots approach. It started with, they used crowdsourcing platform to give everybody in the organisation a voice, to talk about the issues they were facing, to talk about the organisation they want to be, the values and behaviours they expect of each other, and how we're going to get there. And that really is what sets this transformation in motion, because as many of you are sort of saying, this isn't easy. There's lots of resistance within our organisation. So how do we get those people to come on board and think about a different leadership style? And that is what the partnership has showed us, that actually we need to go back to basics. We need to invest time in thinking about collectively what are our organisational values, what's our strategic vision, how are we going to get there. It has to be a collective, it has to be simple, so we keep it simple, so that we can clearly communicate to everybody and we all buy into the same shared goal.
Nicola, sorry, we are not the organization. We don't represent the leadership. You know, most of us over here. Is there a sort of flipped approach to that where we could set up a crowd-sourced platform to be able to communicate? Have you had any thoughts on that?
So to answer your question, I don't see why not, but I don't have any, I haven't any examples of that occurring. I know in Australia, a similar thing was started by a guy called David Ben Tovin. So he was an emergency medical consultant, and he was able to gather a collective of senior consultants to start talking about these things, and that did spread across the department and out to the organisation. So it is possible, I think.
Fantastic. Omo, would you like to come in now, please, and sort of wrap up, if you like, the session in about how exactly do we as individuals get ourselves included? Because we talked a lot about exclusion, we talked a lot about organizations needing to include people. So do you have any thoughts about how we can include people and where we carry on, if you like, this session onto next week?
Thank you very much.
What can we do to be included? What barriers do we break?
I think for me, I think it's just having those difficult conversations, because I think there needs to be more openness and willingness to understand both sides. So it is going to be times of just having those difficult conversations. So I call them courageous conversations, and really just helping people understand your point of view better. But I think a lot of people just decide, well, this is the way it's always been, I can't be bothered, just go to work. But more so now than ever, where nerves are heightened on all dimensions, I think it's important to begin to have those conversations. And even if change doesn't happen immediately, I think being open to have those conversations will ignite change, even if it's in a small way. So I guess that leads us into the next talk that we're having next week. As I said, we're talking about the new pandemic, and really just looking at ways we can increase allyship among all groups, informal, formal leaders, different people from different, hierarchies, should we say, different people from different cultures, really how we can work together to become allies and improve productivity and effectiveness and performance, which is the end, performance for patients, improving outcomes for our patients. So I really want to encourage you to please invite your colleagues to this, because actually we're going to be hearing from an amazing speaker next week, as well as myself, if I must say. So do encourage you to come on that next week, and we'll share 10 tips on what you can actually do to increase allyship among every group in your organization.
Thank you.
Very much. We're past the time, so just want to thank you all for coming. Nicola, thanks for speaking. Mathew, thank you. That was a great talk, and really thank you all for being here. And we'll see you next week, 6 p.m. Please do email any questions that you may have that you want us to explore for next session. Email Vivek or Ali. Is that correct?
Yep, that'll be good.
Or yourself.
Okay. Good night, everyone.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and thank you, Matt. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
See you next
Good
week.
night.